So I haven't really done one of these. Like, I haven't done a video where I just talk about something, and I thought, hey, if I'm going to talk about something, I'm going to talk about something that makes a lot of people really angry. Let me say this. It's Jesus. It's God. I don't think that my perspective is all that strange. And I think that a lot of people have my perspective. They just don't talk about it because they're not told to talk about it. They don't feel compelled to talk about it because it's one of those things that's just not super important to them. There are a lot of people in this world who don't hold any animosity towards God, and they don't really have any hatred or anything. They just want to go about their lives and do their thing. I mean, I would consider myself one of those people. I think a God who isn't mad at me for just living my life and being a good person in general is a better God than a God that's mad at me for just not paying attention to him. That seems really strange. If God wants me to pay attention to him, do something that gets my attention, I guess. I'm not opposed. Like, this is the thing, is I don't have any animosity. So let's do this. This is the promise that never comes. What is the promise that never comes? That's right. I want to talk about broken promises, specifically God's broken promises, or at least promises that people said came from God. Now, if just me saying that was enough for you to think, I don't want to listen to this guy, he's a God-hating heathen, heads up. I'm going to talk about the Bible in a way I don't think you've ever heard the Bible spoken about before. Alternatively, if you're thinking, oh, here it comes, let's take those Christians down a peg, I'm not trying to do that. I'm not going to say Jesus didn't exist, because he did. There is just as much a historical record of Jesus existing as there is Julius Caesar. What I'm going to do is disappoint both of you people. I am not one extreme side or the other. Christians and atheists talk a lot about what they believe. But to be fair, most of them, they don't do a lot of research. Can we just admit that? I mean, I think even people entrenched in one side or the other. Like, I remember when I was a Christian sitting in those pews being like, man, a lot of these people here really don't read their Bible. And I think there's a lot of atheists also who look around at other atheists and they go, these people do not understand simple, basic things about human history or biology. A lot of these people, they don't do a lot of research. They watch videos on YouTube, like this one probably, and think that's research. This, by the way, this is not research. This is just what I believe, which is a result of my research, decades of research. I was a Bible college dropout. I led youth groups. I read my Bible cover to cover over and over. I used to go and do Bible trivia until the people hosting it considered me a cheat, and I wasn't allowed to do Bible trivia anymore. So I knew the Bible. I had my MacArthur Study Bible. Saying all of that, I am not a Christian. I am not resistant to being one. I would be one. I have been one. I'd love to be one again. The idea of a loving God who died for our sins, it sounds wonderful, but I just don't believe it. I don't believe Jesus rose from the dead. But I'm going to talk about more than just Jesus, because this is not just about Jesus, but about our minds and why people believe what they believe about Jesus or any other holy figure in history. It's about being a believer. And now, with all that out of the way, I want to ask, what if the most powerful thing you could ever do to create a devoted, loyal, lifelong believer isn't to give them something? What if it's to promise to give them something and then just never give it to them? What if the waiting is the thing that makes them believe in the first place? Because here's what we're going to trace together. It's a pattern, a really old pattern, a pattern that shows up so consistently across so many different times and places and cultures that at some point you have to stop calling it a coincidence and start asking, what does this tell us about our minds? What does this tell us about belief? It goes like this. Step one, God or a prophet, or someone who's just generally enlightened. They make a big, specific, world-changing promise. Step two, history does not cooperate. The promise clearly breaks, doesn't happen. Step three, someone explains that the promise, it's not broken, it's just deferred. It's delayed, it's coming soon, they're kicking the can down the road. And then, step four, and this is the crucial one, people believe that, and they keep believing it. And they keep waiting. Because what if it's true? What if you give up right before it happens? And what if doubting it will ever happen means you're bad and you're going to the bad place where bad people go for doubting? And then, eventually, occasionally, there's a step 5. Sometimes the whole process repeats. This isn't a story about bad people doing cynical things. That's not what happened, and I want to be really clear about that. The Bible is not that story. This is a story about sincere people, earnest, searching, sometimes brilliant people doing very human things, trying to make meaning out of chaos. But sincerity, it turns out, is not the same as truth. So let's go way back. Let's go to around 1000 BC in Jerusalem. King David, he's having a good run. He's captured Jerusalem, he made it his capital, he defeated the Philistines, he brought the Ark of the Covenant into the city, he's doing the successful ancient Near Eastern king thing. He's centralized power and he's wrapping himself in this divine authority. Smart king stuff. And so he proposes to build God a temple. God says, actually, no, you won't build me a house. I'm going to build you one. Talking to David. God promises David in 2 Samuel chapter 7 this. And this is where all the drama begins. God promises, he says, your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. Forever. He says it twice. It's unconditional language. God is making a political guarantee. There will always be a Davidic king on the throne of Israel. But here's something important to understand. At this point, at this exact moment in history, there is no concept of the Messiah. The Hebrew word just meant anointed one. Saul was anointed. David was anointed. High priests were anointed. It's a job description, not a god or a son of God or anything like that. It was something interchangeable with the term Ben Adam, which means son of man. A title that was given to like Ezekiel and all these other people. It meant anointed one, not the physical manifestation of God, made man walking the earth. That concept just didn't exist. The concept, it is yet to be invented. And it gets invented because history breaks the Davidic promise from 2 Samuel chapter 7. Because, spoiler alert, Babylon destroys everything. Leading up to this, though, the kingdom is split into two, between the north and the south, after Solomon, King David's son and successor, makes what I would consider to be some choices. The northern tribe, they break away, but Assyria conquers those tribes and exiles them, and they're gone entirely from history. They're done. Judah, the southern half, survives for another century, but like barely. And then, in 586 BC, Babylon just lays siege to Jerusalem. 2 Kings 25 describes what happens. The last Davidic king, and his name is Zedekiah, he watches his sons executed in front of him, and then the Babylonians blind him, and they take him in chains to Babylon. The throne is gone. The temple is destroyed. The promise, the forever promise, the twice forever promise, appears by any reasonable reading to just be broken. Psalm 89 puts it right out there. The writer, bemoaning to God, says, "You have renounced the covenant with your servant. You have defiled his crown in the dust." This, though, is the moment. This is where everything gets real messy, because this is where the deferred promise is born. The prophets, they don't say God was wrong. They don't say the promise failed. The monarchy is merely in hiatus. It's not abolished. It's not over. They just say that the promise is delayed. And there is a condition now, retroactively applied, of course, that the dynasty will continue as long as kings obey, which apparently they didn't, which is fair, actually. So, kingdom goes boom, boom, and bye-bye. The promise, secretly, had strings attached, which we're just learning about now. But listen, not over, because Ezekiel says this: the crown will not be restored until he to whom it is rightfully belongs shall come. He, a future king, the one who will restore everything. And this is the exact moment in exile, in catastrophe, in the ruins of a broken promise and kingdom that the idea of the Messiah comes along. Not just an anointed one, I'm talking the anointed one. The one who is coming, the one who will fix all of this, you gotta wait. He will be a human descendant of David. He will restore Jewish sovereignty. He will gather the exiles. He will rebuild the temple. He will bring world peace. He will not die before completing the task, and he will definitely not be executed by some sort of, I don't know, on a tree, because in Deuteronomy 21, that is a curse. That's not what the Messiah will look like, not even close. That's a very specific criteria. They are written down. They will matter later. The return from exile eventually does happen. And then, nothing. No Davidic king. Instead, we get Persian rule, then we get Greek rule, then by the 1st century of the Common Era, that's AD, Roman rule. Centuries pass, the promise remains what it has been since 586 BC, when Ezekiel flipped the script. The promise is simply deferred, and it will, trust me you guys, someday be fulfilled. Here's something that the Sunday school version of the Gospels tend to skip over. Jesus was not the only person during the Roman occupation of Judea who claimed to be, or even believed to be, the Messiah. Not even close. The 1st century was, to put it mildly, a cornucopia of Masonic figures. And why is that? Well, Roman occupation. It was brutal and humiliating for the Jewish people. Taxes were crushing. There was a massive gap between the rich and the poor. The apocalyptic expectation, the sense that God was about to act, that history was reaching its climax, that the Messiah was imminent, it was in the air everywhere. It was a very common belief at the time that the world was ending, and people were looking. And when people are looking that hard for something, they tend to find that something. So, let's go through the list. There was Judas of Galilee, and no, not that Judas, who led a revolt against Roman taxation around like 6 AD, and he gathered a bunch of believers who believed he was the Messiah. However, dude died, and so did the movement. There will be a trend with that, by the way. Then there was Theudas, who told his followers that he would part the Jordan River, just like Moses parted the Red Sea, leading them to liberation. However, the Roman governor, Faudus, sent cavalry, and Theudas was beheaded. Then there was a figure referred to in Acts as just the Egyptian, an unnamed prophet who led thousands into the desert, promising to bring down the walls of Jerusalem with just a word. Rome responded with infantry. The followers scattered. He went into exile. Fun fact, the Apostle Paul was mistaken for this guy at one point. There were tons of these people running around during Jesus' time. But I want to talk about one more before we get to Jesus. And a century after Jesus, there was a man named Simon, and he led the revolt of 132 to 135 AD. Rabbi Akiva, one of the most respected scholars in all Jewish history, declared Simon to be the Messiah. This was not a fringe opinion. This was the leading rabbi of his generation making a formal declaration. This is because Simon led a massive uprising against Rome, briefly established an independent Jewish state. He even minted his own coins. But then Rome sent 12 legions, and Simon was, you guessed it, killed. They did it a lot. And the revolt was crushed. Rabbi Akiva, in all fairness, conceded that this man failed to meet the criteria of the Messiah, though he came close. However, after that, Jerusalem was rebuilt as a Roman city that Jews were forbidden from entering, further deferring the promise. Rabbi Akiva, by the way, back to him, brilliant, sincere, learned. However, he was wrong. I will give him credit. After Simon's death, the rabbis changed his name from the Hebrew word for son of the star, a Masonic title from Numbers 24. They started calling him Kazaba, son of the lie. Still, it's also important that I clarify here that the rabbis of that time, they didn't just conclude that there is no longer going to be a Messiah. They simply just concluded that Simon was not that person and that the waiting continues. So, what about Jesus? Yes, when Jesus enters this field, the crowded field of candidates for the Messiah, he is a compelling candidate. He's charismatic. He draws crowds. He speaks about the kingdom of God, not as a metaphor, not as a spiritual interior state, but as a real imminent this world event. He believes, it seems quite sincerely, that God is about to act and is using him to do it, that the end of the current age is close. In Matthew 16, Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man," which I established means the Messiah, "coming in his kingdom." He thinks it's happening now, in his lifetime, in the lifetimes of the people he's speaking to. And then, spoiler alert, Rome crucifies him. So, by the established criteria, the criteria written down during exile long ago, it's been a standard for 600 years. Jesus fails the test. No restored sovereignty, no gathered exiles, no rebuilt temple, no era of world peace, and crucifixion specifically, according to Deuteronomy, makes his run for Messiah a clear fail. From a Jewish perspective, and Jesus was Jewish, and his followers were Jewish, and in their tradition, the conclusion is not that complicated. He was not the one. On to the next candidate. But then, something weird happens. His name is Saul. He's from Tarsus. He's a Pharisee, educated, devout, serious about Jewish law. He is, by his own description, in Philippians 3, zealous in persecuting the followers of Jesus. This failed, blasphemous Messiah, how dare they? He is absolutely certain about what he believes. And then, on the road to Damascus, something happens. He later describes it as seeing a blinding light and hearing the voice of Jesus. He falls to the ground. He is temporarily blinded. He is transformed, and he becomes Paul. And Paul rewrites the criteria. And this is not a small thing. This is a categorical reinvention. Jesus didn't restore the kingdom, but that's because the real restoration is coming at his return. Jesus was executed, but that death was itself the point. A cosmic sacrifice for sin. Jesus didn't rebuild the temple, but the physical temple is now beside the point, because the real temple is the community of believers. It is the body of Christ. It's something internal, and it's something spiritual. Every item on that Messiah checklist that Jesus didn't complete is reinterpreted by Paul. The promise is not broken. It is just deferred. Again. But let's slow down here, because we should take Paul's experience, I think, a little bit more seriously, because I don't think it's worth dismissing. Because what actually happened on that road? Paul was under enormous stress. He was a deeply religious man who had been violently persecuting a movement he believed was dangerous. The cognitive weight of that, of hurting people in God's name, which clearly never happens again in human history, his absolute certainty was used as a weapon. And I think that's important. He was traveling, physically exhausted, probably sleep deprived, and he was going somewhere where he intended to continue his campaign of torture and arrests. That is not a pleasant day that he has to look forward to. And in that state, he sees someone who has recently died. What a miracle? What an oddity? Well, what if I told you that having a vision of someone who's dead is actually quite ordinary? Because, all right, science time, everybody. Studies consistently show that somewhere between 50 to 80% of breathing people have reported seeing, hearing, or otherwise sensing the presence of a deceased loved ones. These experiences are vivid, they're specific, they're emotionally real, and they occur across all cultures, across levels of religious belief, and even among people who would describe themselves as skeptics, atheists, or bad tippers. Hospice workers who sit with people at the end of life will tell you that visions of deceased relatives in the hours before death are so common. They're practically standard. These are not, may I mind you, delusions. They are normal features of the human mind under certain conditions. This is kind of a built-in part of certain experiences in our life. I know you atheists are mad that I'm saying that, and I don't care because that's what science says. Your temporal lobes, they start at your temples and they go right behind your ears, are the integration hub for memory, emotion, spiritual existence, and meaning making. They are also the part of the brain most likely to misfire under stress, sleep deprivation, physical exhaustion, or just grief. This is due to that part of the brain's high plasticity. It's constantly restructuring itself, which can, at times, cause some mishaps. So, when the temporal lobes experience a misfire, the outcome can be something that feels extraordinarily real. And that's not the same as something being imagined. It's real, in the full subjective sense of the word, indistinguishable from waking perception. Paul was stressed. Can we at least admit that? He was grieving over all this crazy violence that he had committed. He was also physically depleted. He had been on the road for a while, and he was steeped in a tradition that said the Messiah was coming. Everyone at the time believed this. God was about to act. History was at a very pivotal moment. The world as we know it is coming to an end. His mind gave him what it had. It gave him Jesus. I want to be careful though, because this is important. I'm not saying Paul was lying. I am not saying Paul was crazy. I am saying Paul had an experience that was completely physiologically normal. And with today's specific understanding of the mind, it's also explainable that he interpreted that experience through the only framework he had, which was the framework of the Jewish Messiah, this one Messiah who is coming, we promise. The apocalyptic expectations everyone had at that time really served deeply into this. He experienced something real, but his interpretation of that experience may not have been true. And can you see where I'm walking the line here, you guys? Like, I'm not trying to hurt anybody's feelings. I'm just telling you what I believe. And here's the thing about Paul that I think deserves genuine respect. He believed it completely. He gave up everything. He was beaten, shipwrecked, imprisoned. And according to the Christian tradition, he was executed for what he believed. You don't do that for a lie. You don't do that because you made something up and you don't want anyone to know. You do that for a truth that is so real to you that the world doesn't offer you anything more important. Paul, I believe, was sincere, and I think it's crazy to believe he wasn't. However, sincerity is not the same as truth. Now, once you see this pattern in human history of a promise made, a promise deferred, once you see it, you can't unsee it. The deferred promise isn't just a Jewish thing or a Christian thing, it's a human thing. It shows up everywhere. There is suffering, expectation, and the need to make sense of all this brokenness in the world. It's savage out there. It always has been. And if someone came up to me and said that all the bad stuff is going to go away, I want to believe that. That sounds wonderful. It makes sense. I want that to be true. In 1666, a Jewish mystic named Zevi attracted what may be the most widespread messianic following in Jewish history. Hundreds of thousands of Jews across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, including established rabbis, merchants, scholars, they all were convinced he was the Messiah. People sold their houses. People left their jobs. The year 1666 was going to be the year. The promise was finally going to be resolved. But then, flattening what is a very long story, the Ottoman Sultan at the time gave Zevi a choice: convert to Islam or die. And guess what? Zevi converted. Now, most followers eventually abandoned that movement, but a significant number found a way to reinterpret what happened, and once again, the promise is deferred and not broken. Thus, a new Jewish sect begins. A small number of these believers still exist today. Then there's Reverend William Miller. He was an American Baptist preacher who used biblical calculations to determine that Christ would return specifically on October 22nd, 1844. This man, if anything, was meticulous. He was also very persuasive. He attracted somewhere between like 50 to 100,000 followers, and they genuinely rearranged their lives in expectation of that date. However, last time I checked, October 22nd, 1844, it came and went. This event was known as the Great Disappointment, and it sure was for a lot of people. And most followers left. But a core group concluded that the event had indeed occurred, just invisibly in heaven in a way that wouldn't be visible until later. This group became the Seventh-day Adventists. They now have about like 21 million followers worldwide. So once again, the promise was deferred. I can keep going. The Jehovah's Witnesses, they've predicted specific dates for Armageddon like 5 times. Like it was 1914, 1918, 1925, 1942, 1975. Each time a date passes, the interpretation just shifts. They move the goalpost every time. It's ridiculous. Millions of members, though, still waiting. I mean, there's cargo cults. There's Heaven's Gate. The structure is always the same. The promise is real, but history breaks it. So the promise is reframed as deferred. The waiting continues. The community remains. So what's going on here? Why does this happen? You know, there's a psychology in waiting. And let's talk about the sunk cost of the soul, right? So in 1956, a psychologist named Leon Festinger did something remarkable, infiltrating a doomsday cult, which would be so fun. What this guy did was he observed what happened when the date passed and the world didn't end. And what he found was very counterintuitive, but deeply revealing. Many members became more committed after the failure, not less. They didn't walk away. In fact, a lot of them became evangelists. But he had an explanation for this. It's just cognitive dissonance, you guys. The mind can't comfortably hold the thought, I gave up everything for a belief that was wrong. That thought is just, it hurts, you know, it's too costly. So instead, it reaches for, no, the prophecy, it was just misunderstood. The timeline, it shifted. The mission, it can continue. And now I need to tell others because my commitment, it proves the truth of it all. And the longer you have waited, the more you have invested. Relationships built around this belief. I mean, identity is formed inside of it. Sacrifices are made for it. Years are given to this thing, man. The cost of concluding you were wrong rise with every time you put something more into it. And since the community is often like your only community, leaving that belief often means leaving everything. That's not just a theological problem. That is a human problem. Now, a specific prediction, it can fail. The world will end October 22nd, 1844. That can be tested. And by the way, you guys, that prediction did fail. But when you say something like, the Messiah will come when the time is right, that can't fail. There's no date. There is no specific observable event whose absence would count as disconfirmation. Every year the promise goes unfulfilled can just be reinterpreted as a sign of the times. It's a test of faith. It's a necessary precondition. Remember, we added those later. This is not the same, though, as dishonesty. The people who make these arguments often believe them fully. It is a structural feature of a certain kind of promise. They are designed, perhaps accidentally, I would like to propose, in a way that makes them impossible to disprove. And belief systems that can't be disproven have a significant survival advantage over ones that can. So, let's talk about intermittent reinforcement. Behavioral psychology figured out a long time ago that intermittent, unpredictable rewards create stronger behavioral attachment than consistent ones. Let's talk about like the slot machine. That's a good example. If you always won, gambling would be, it'd be great, but it would also be very boring. If you never won though, you'd stop. But winning sometimes, unpredictably, that's the structure that keeps you playing. The deferred promise works in a similar way. You can't have the ultimate fulfillment. That's always coming. That's always just past the horizon. But you can have small little breadcrumbs, little confirmations along the way, a little personal miracle. You can hear about something on the radio or TV. You can have a moment of spiritual clarity, a religious experience, this emotional rush. You can see some sort of historical event that seems to match some prophecy. These intermittent confirmations sustain the expectation, but without ever really fulfilling it or satisfying it. The reward is always just far enough ahead to keep you walking towards it. Another thing is community. And I think this is actually the most powerful part. It's not just a theological claim. It's the organizing principle of an entire community, this promise. To stop waiting for the promise is not simply to change something you believe. It's potentially losing your entire community. Something to mention is that this community that you might lose, it's real. It's not some discombobulated, confabulated delusion. The friendships are real. The mutual support that you get is real. The sense of belonging to something larger than yourself, that's real. These are genuine goods, you guys, and they don't require the promise to be literally true in order for all of these things to be valuable. But they do create powerful incentives to keep believing, or at least keep belonging, which sometimes is the same thing. Let's talk about what it costs to keep waiting. This promise deferred, it's not neutral. Waiting has costs, and it's worth naming these costs honestly. And one of the things that I want to talk about is that when the present world is understood as kind of a waiting room, temporary, fallen, about to be replaced by heaven, by something so good, investment in this world gets, at the very least, complicated. Why fight climate change if the rapture is coming? Why build institutions for long term if history is about to end? This isn't, by the way, hypothetical. I can tell you, I was one of these people. When I was all about that Jesus, you think I cared what happened to the environment? No, because the world was going to go poof any day now. Why care? Why care about the future? There is no future. Our future is not here. It's somewhere else. And the deferred promise can defer everything else along with it. And that has a real cost. Now, let's talk about this. The deferred promise seems to always come with conditions. And the more it gets deferred, the more conditions seem to arise. So you have to behave correctly. You have to maintain your purity. You have to follow the law. You can't be like those naughty kings before. No, no, no. And someone gets to define what that means. Usually the person who reframes this promise and says, oh, no. This is how I can keep this thing going. The gatekeeper of correct behavior sometimes becomes indispensable from the promise because the gate is between the community and the thing that you are waiting for. This dynamic can generate genuine ethical issues. It can also generate something darker. And I'm talking cults. I'm talking the entire history of authoritarian religious leadership. It is largely a history of this promise-deferred structure taken to its very worst conclusion. And there's a foreclosure completely on grief. Now, what does that mean? When a promise is perpetually reinterpreted rather than acknowledged as unfulfilled, it becomes very hard to grieve what was actually lost. The exiles couldn't simply mourn the end of the Davidic kingdom and rebuild on honest grounds. They had to keep hoping it would come back. Jesus' first followers couldn't sit with the fact that their teacher had been executed and the kingdom hadn't come. They had to keep waiting. There is something important that gets lost in the perpetual deferral. The ability to say, hey, this didn't work. It turned out to be wrong. Now what? You just don't have that. I want to end kind of someplace a little real. Because I believe I don't believe, I know this to be true. I know that King David was real, the exile was real, the loss was real, the people who sat by the rivers of Babylon and wept, they were real people with real grief, and the hope they constructed to survive that grief was not cynical manipulation. It was human beings doing what human beings do, which is trying to make meaning out of what's a catastrophe. Jesus was real. Whatever he was, prophet, failed Messiah, genuine believer in his own mission, he was a real person who walked around in first century Judea and said things, boy howdy did he say the darndest things, and they mattered to people. He probably believed the world was ending soon. He was probably wrong about that. His death devastated the people who believed in him. Paul was real. His experience on the road to Damascus also was real. Real in the way that all profound subjective experience is real. And his decades of missionary work, his beatings, his imprisonment, his death, those things were real too. You don't do that for a con. You do that for what you believe is truth. The evangelical Christian who genuinely believes the rapture is near, these people are not stupid. They are not all being cynically manipulated. They are doing something very human, which is finding meaning and community and purpose inside of a story about a promise. But the story has a structure, and the structure is, here's the promise. It hasn't been fulfilled yet. Stay, behave, and wait. And the question that I have that has tormented me for a long time in my life was not, well, is the promise true? That's actually not the most important question. That's not the thing that really bugged me. It was this. What are you doing with your life while you wait? Because the promise to David has been deferred for roughly 2,600 years now. The return of Jesus has been deferred for roughly 2,000 years. Nobody in the first century, not Jesus, not Paul, not any of the disciples, believed it would take this long. The whole promise was a thing that was happening now, soon, within a generation. That was the belief, and was always the belief. It was not 2,000 years. Nobody thought it was going to be 2,000 years. The crown has been in the dust since 586 BC. We have been told many times by many sincere, sometimes brilliant people that someone is coming to pick it up.